for greeting us. This is an event organized by the Swiss Confederation and two universities, the University of Geneva and the EAWAG, which is the Aquatic Research Center in Zurich, in relation with the ETH Zurich. And we are really pleased to greet you. It's not directly related to ice melt and polar region, but it's very important, as we all know that it's very key for us to keep 1.5 alive. And we wanted to make that session in this particular COP, COP28, because we are at the crossroads just after the last COP28 decision on the global stocktake, which was last year, and which reaffirmed the targets of the IPCC just to reduce by 43% on average, at least by 2030, the emission of GHG, and also to go fastest during this decade on energy transition. It's the famous paragraph 28 of the GST decision, just to transition away from fossil fuel. And all this decision of the COP28 has now to be clearly reflected in the very next stage of climate action, which are the next NDCs, the next commitments that will be taken by the parties, which would have to publish them in March, maybe a bit later, but in March, and to be sure to close, at least in their pledges, in their contributions, this emission gap, and to be aligned as best as possible to the 1.5 limit. And it's not a goal, it's a limit that we would not have to overshoot. And also to be in line with this famous now paragraph 28 on energy transition, transitioning away, developing from fossil fuel, developing energy, renewables, energy efficiency. So this panel, I'm very pleased as a professor at the University of Geneva and head of the Institute for Environmental Science, also member of the Swiss delegation as the embedded scientist. I'm really pleased to moderate and introduce this panel session. We will first see a video recorded by our Swiss IPCC Working Group 1 Vice Chair, Sonia Senevi-Ratne, who will talk about more ambitious NDCs and how they are necessary to keep 1.5 limits alive and ensure global safety. She just recorded this video this morning, so she could not be here due to a conflict in the agenda, but she's clearly with us and just recording her video this morning. Then we will hear Dr. Carrie Duprike from the University of Geneva and Niklas Wagner from the University of Bonn. She and he will give us some words about a new research project that they are launching at the University of Geneva on the last global stocktake that we just talked about, which was this very important moment of the first global stocktake ever of the Paris Agreement, and how we can talk about or not of a success story for the negotiation process and multilateralism. And then we will be with Tony Pat from the ETH Zurich. We will talk about the societal transitions perspective on the next NDCs and this necessary perspective to raise ambitions through the next NDCs. And then we will finish here in Baku with Paola Castro from the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, who will talk about NDC ambition, mitigation policy efforts, and the way we could engage in transnational climate governance initiatives. So I would like to thank them warmly, just to also advise them to speak as loud as possible, as I'm trying to make it right now, and to think in that direction because it's very helpful. Not like that, but clearly in that direction, please. So this being said, thanks to everyone in the room. We have the pavilion is full, so that's a great news. And also this event will be recorded, and you will be able to see it then remotely and to promote it as well. So thanks a lot. And now we give the floor to Sonia Senemiratne.
I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak in this session. As I will show here, more ambitious indices are necessary to keep the 1.5-degree limit alive and to keep us safe. Here I'm showing a picture from a recent event that happened in Valencia, Spain. A few weeks ago, there was massive, heavy precipitation that occurred and they led to extreme flooding in the region. Several hundreds of persons died as a result of this event, and there was also extreme damage, as you can see on this picture. So human-induced climate change is already killing people and leading to destruction right now. I'm showing other such events that happened in recent years, which were clearly attributed to human-induced climate change. For instance, in 2022, a drought across Europe, most of the continent was affected by it. It was the driest summer in 500 years, according to several hydrological reports. Burnt forest area, and there was also an extreme heat wave associated with this event, which led to about 61,000 deaths around the continent. In the same year, in 2022, there was also massive flooding in Pakistan, where about 1/3 of the country was underwater. There was more than 1,700 deaths. And there was extreme damage from it, with about 30 billion flood damage and economic losses. In 2023, there was extreme burning of forest in Canada. The total burnt area was equivalent to 4 times the area of Switzerland, as associated emissions were equivalent to 3 times the yearly emissions of Canada. Finally, as one other event, and there would be many more to mention, in 2023 there was heavy precipitation in the Mediterranean. And for instance, in Libya, these events led to extreme damage and also many people dying of this event, about 11,000 to 20,000 deaths. So as mentioned, we see directly now the impacts of human-induced climate change, and these impacts are extremely high. So global warming continues to increase year after year. You see the long-term trend here. That's from the Copernicus Climate Service. We are clearly in a climate emergency. Limiting mean global warming to 1.5 degrees or close to it, so at most with 0.1 degree overshoot, requires immediate action. In 2023, we were very close to 1.5 degrees of warming for a single year. We expect that in 2024, this year, we are going for the first time to be at 1.5 degrees or above. This means we're coming extremely close to the mean global warming of 1.5 degrees average over several years, and we have no time. We need to act immediately if we want to have a chance of stabilizing global warming to about 1.5 degrees. About the relationship between our decisions and global warming, we know the main cause of global warming is the accumulation of CO2 emissions. This is a well-known figure from the IPCC report showing that you have an almost linear relationship between cumulative CO2 emissions and global warming. So the more CO2 emissions are accumulating in the atmosphere, the more global warming we have. The effects of CO2 emission is very long-term. That's why we are looking here at cumulative CO2 emissions since the middle of the 19th century, because once emitted, they have an impact for several hundreds of years to several thousands of years. So every additional emissions of CO2 lead to additional global warming. And this also means that the CO2 budget for 1.5 degrees is becoming smaller every year. Every year we have an additional emissions of CO2, means that the CO2 budget is becoming smaller. The cause of human-induced global warming is clear. The main source of CO2 emission is the burning of fossil fuel. You see in this figure, which is from the last IPCC report, that about 90% of all CO2 emissions come from fossil fuel burning. For instance, burning of gas, burning of oil or petrol, and burning of coal. Here I'm showing a figure from the IPCC synthesis report, which shows what are the CO2 budgets when we reach net zero. We know that we need to reach net zero CO2 if we want to stabilize global warming, since any additional emissions leads to more global warming. In those budgets, and here we can focus on the part of the bars that are in purple, blue, and green, which represent the CO2 emissions, which is most important for long-term effects. In those bars, you see that we start in 2019 for about 40 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year, which is still about the level of emissions right now. And here for the budgets of scenarios which are compatible with the limitation of global warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, you see that the remaining emissions here above zero are extremely small. This means that CO2 emissions at net zero compared to today would be mostly related to reduction of emissions. Typically, it's about 90% decrease of CO2 emissions. You could have about 10% of remaining emissions. And then this remaining 10% of emissions would be compensated by 10% of negative emissions, such as carbon dioxide removal, afforestation, or other types of technology. But as you can see here, this is a very small part. This is why the main effort needs to be invested into the reduction of CO2 emissions, especially because the emissions are still so high now that we need effort right now. Here is a figure from the IPCC synthesis report, which showed that with implemented policies, we expected a global warming of about 3.2 degrees at the end of the century. The nationally determined contributions indices range in 2030 would put us in a slightly better trajectory, but still, clearly, we are absolutely not on track of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. For this, we need much more immediate effort in the coming years, as we will not be able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. This means, in terms of decision-making, for the NDCs that will be decided by February 2025, that we need substantially more ambitious indices for short-term CO2 emission reduction until 2030. That's what is absolutely needed, as we are not going to be able to achieve the targets that were set in the Paris Agreement. Here, this is an extremely important figure. We have now new estimates of the remaining CO2 budget. This is a figure, this is a paper that was prepared by several authors, about more than 50 scientists, many of them involved in the IPCC report. And this paper includes an update of several metrics that were computed in the last IPCC report, among others also the remaining CO2 budget. Given the emissions that we have had in recent years, the IPCC estimate at the time of the remaining CO2 budget was for 2020, but we have had 4 more years of emissions since then. And we see that now the remaining CO2 budget for 2024 is about 200 gigatons of CO2. That's actually half of the amount we had at the time. This means that we need much more drastic action if we want to have a chance to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, because this budget is decreasing extremely fast. About the visions we can have for the future, we know we are in a climate emergency. Situation is getting worse every year. If we don't do enough efforts, our world might look like the picture here on the left, with always increasing number of climate extremes and more impacts. But we can decarbonize our society. We can have basically more use of renewables and moving away from fossil fuels, which is the picture on the right. I come to the conclusions. The 1.5 degree limit is starting to get out of reach. That is really important to know. This is probably the critical COP to make sure that we can still limit global warming to around 1.5 degrees. More ambitious indices need to be submitted by countries until February 2025 to keep a chance of stabilizing global warming at about 1.5 degrees with limited overshoot. We are in a climate emergency with people already dying and major damage being induced because of human-induced climate change. Every avoided CO2 emissions means less global warming and less change in extreme for several human generations. The main solution to the current crisis and emergency is the reduction of present-day emissions, mostly related to fossil fuel burning. For instance, especially through a shift to renewable energy, solar and wind, and the electrification of energy use. At the moment, we are not on track, but some recent developments go in the right direction. For instance, there's been decreased price and increasing use of renewable energy, but we need and should accelerate change in progress. And I will finish with these few words from a video from IPCC following the 1.5 degree special report. Every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Thank you very much for the attention.
So thank you, and I will thank Sonia in your name on distance later. But Sonia showed us that clearly there are major impacts and risks that we are collectively facing right now at this level of temperature rise, and it's very urgent to curb this temperature rise and those emissions. He also explained this very important figure, which is that now the remaining carbon budget that is updated is not anymore what we heard during a long time, like 450 gigatons or 500 gigatons, but it's now only 200 gigatons. And it's mainly related to the fact that we are not even peaking, and we are at the worldwide scale, we are keeping on track, on staying on a kind of 40 to 45 gigatons a year of emission. And so Sonia also clearly stated that we have to work on new NDCs that would clearly modify the pace of emission and take into account all the transitions on energy and emission that are required. And to make it, there was one key moment in the life of the Paris Agreement, which was the first global stocktake. In the architecture of the Paris Agreement, there is that kind of system of pledge and review, and the global stocktake was the first review process. And moreover, it was very open to the civil society. It was called to include the civil society and not only expertise and science. And now I invite Carrie Depry and Niklas Wagner to talk about this first global stocktake and what kind of question we could raise from this first stocktake for the future of multilateralism. Thank you. And I invite Carrie and the and Carrie.
Yeah, thank you, Geraldine, for giving us the floor. So maybe just before starting, Niklas and I, we are both social scientists, so more on the political science, sociology side. And so we are going to present to you a bit the project that we recently got accepted. It's, as Geraldine was saying, it's going to focus on the first global stocktake, which was conducted between 2023 and 2024. It was presented as the engine of the Paris Agreement, an ambition mechanism to make sure that the world doesn't backtrack on the Paris Agreement, and more broadly as a motor of transformation to align to 1.5 and to get to low carbon societies. Its main outcome, the UEA consensus, was agreed last year in Dubai at COP28 and was hailed a success. It contains valuable guidance and information on how to strengthen the nationally determined contribution that are expected next year and will be discussed at COP30 in Belém. And it calls on both parties and non-party stakeholders to increase ambition. However, it remains to be seen whether the global stocktake was truly transformative and ambitious, and that's what we want to study with Niklas and other colleagues, Geraldine being also the co-coordinator of this project. We were awarded in July this year funding by the Swiss Network for International Studies to conduct a research trying to take stock of this first global stocktake. It will run over 2 years, starting next year in March 2025. and will end in February 2027. And it will be coordinated by myself and Geraldine. And Niklas, my colleague, will join us as postdoctoral researcher next year. So we all three have been following the first GST as either embedded scientists or observers. And we have actually already gathered quite a lot of data. The project will receive as well targeted feedback from different colleagues and partners, from different institutions, including the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, Zurich University of Applied Sciences, with Paula being part of the project, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and the World Resource Institute. So we will publish peer-reviewed paper as well as a policy brief trying to get out lessons learned for the second global stocktake. So it's informed by social science approaches that acknowledge that the outcome of international negotiations are not only determined by material or external factors like predetermined interest or the dependence on fossil fuel, but also on the process through which those negotiations occur. So it tells us, for instance, that the process is very important to understand the uptake of particular outcomes, and that the more, for instance, the more inclusive and transparent a process, the more legitimate and also the most impactful. In that regard, openness, inclusivity, and transparency were central in the GST, and in particular in its technical dialogue, which brought both parties and non-party stakeholders, but also not only scientific knowledge through, for instance, the IPCC, but also different input from experts in different regions and organizations. Process is also important once an outcome has been reached, as having clear guidance on how an outcome feeds into decision making is obviously essential. And here we are speaking about linking the outcome of the global stocktake to the definition of the new nationally determined contributions. And again, in that regard, discussions are ongoing right now about the scope and format of the UEA dialogue, which is expected to support the implementation of the consensus that was reached last year in Dubai. So we aim through observation, interviews, document analysis, we aim to assess the extent to which the global stocktake process was inclusive in terms of input provision and deliberation by party and non-party stakeholders, the extent to which the deliberations and the GST outcome reflected different perspectives, the extent to which the GST outcome provided clear guidance on how to enhance new NDCs, and the extent to which recommendations from the GST were reflected in the new NDCs.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you for the invitation, Geraldine. Quickly introduction of myself. My name is Niklas Wagner. I'm currently finishing my PhD at the University of Bonn. And I was very happy when I was contacted by Geraldine and Kari in March to join this postdoctoral project, and even happier when we got the acceptance. Yes. So we have been studying this global stocktake throughout the week, but as well already, I've been in this for the last 2 years basically, and it's very interesting to see this discussion on how we create like a document which wants to assess the objective of the Paris Agreement in an inclusive manner. And this is exactly what we are trying to assess in this project. At the moment, we are following the negotiations, and especially the negotiations on the procedural elements of the GST are, for us and for this project, very insightful, because there the parties and the civil society, they're discussing how the first global stocktake came about, what went well and how to improve it. And we're hearing a lot that there needs to be improvement in terms of participation and inclusiveness, acknowledging that it was already quite inclusive relative to many other processes here within the convention. But still, what is really highlighted, especially by the developing country parties, is that there needs to be more capacity and support for developing countries, as well as civil society, of course, is trying to make their point that it needs to be more inclusive for gender and for female representation, for youth and other civil society observers. What else are we observing? So we are, this is on the GST procedural elements. Interesting as well at the moment, and most of you will have noticed this importance of the UAE dialogue, because it blocked the agenda for the first day. The discussion right now on what to focus on in the UAE dialogue. So we have two blocks of parties. One block is saying we want it more to be focused on the provision of finance, and the other one is having the view that it should be a broader view on the different elements which are covered within the GST outcome. And yeah, this is a little bit what we are right now discussing. We are as well conducting our interviews with different stakeholders on this at the moment, and trying to have their diversity between regions and gender, as well as stakeholder types. And as well, as Carrie mentioned, we are conducting some text analysis of the NDCs as well as the NAPs, so the national adaptation plans, and trying to understand how the GST outcome was important for informing the NDCs and the NAPs. And very interestingly, in every NDC, so every country right now is or should submit their new NDC, and there is a section on how the GST was helpful, and we had a preliminary look at two of the NDCs which were already submitted, and for the UAE, for example, they only provide us with one sentence of how the GST was helpful for their NDC, but for Brazil it's several pages where they specify how energy transition, deforestation, and everything was informed specifically by the GST outcome. And we're trying to get more details on this as well with interviews, and try to understand really how can we improve this in the future. I think we're very excited and are looking forward to sharing more insights on this with you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carrie and Niklas. And indeed, it's for us very important to analyze the history of negotiation and this very key moment of the global stocktake, because it's very important for the next steps that we expect to be more efficient again, hopefully in the climate regime in the coming years. And moreover, as you mentioned, the GST decision was very complete, very wide in some sense. I used to say that the GST decision is twice as long as the Paris Agreement itself. So it's added much more provision on energy, on deforestation, much more precise. And it's going to be very important right now, the exercise that you begin to make, and you exemplified with the recent UAE NDC, or the very recent Brazil NDC, which was published just yesterday, to see how they take into account this decision and how it's also related to the way this decision was built and legitimized through the process. So thanks a lot for your intervention. And now we are moving to this future, this short-term future on the coming NDCs, and we will have two complementary perspectives. And the first one will be from Tony Platt, from professor at the ETA Zurich, and also he was author in the working group 3 report of the last IPCC cycle, and he will talk about societal transitions perspective on NDCs and rising ambition. So Tony, you are with you. Thanks a lot for being here, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. It's a pleasure to be there virtually, both to be there and also to have not have to flown a third of the way around the world to get there and not cause those emissions. So I want to give a societal transitions perspective on NDCs and rising ambition. A fair amount of this flows out of work that I did as coordinating.
Tony, could you try to speak as louder as you can?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm going to speak as loud as I can. It's a pleasure to be there, and also a pleasure to be able to do this remotely rather than have to fly, which I think is a very good thing. I want to give a societal transitions perspective on NDCs and rising ambition. And to some extent, this flows out of work that I did as coordinating lead author on the chapter on international cooperation for the IPCC in the 6th assessment report. It also comes from some of the work that we're doing right now at ETH and have done in recent years. And I guess I want to preface this with what's on the next slide. Next slide, please. And let's see. Next slide. Yeah, and it's simply, I think, recognizing what most of us are recognizing. The WMO just came out with this news announcement that 2024 is temporarily hitting 1.5 degrees. It may get cooler again, but honestly, I think it's hard to imagine that humanity can avoid overshooting 1.5 degrees. And simply put, I don't see the slide anymore. Somehow, if it changed.
That's fine.
It's okay? Okay, good. The less the overshoot, the greater the chance of correcting for it. There will be an awful lot of carbon dioxide removal, which will be necessary to get back to 1.5. The less we overshoot, the more likely it is we'll be able to do that. And hence, we keep 1.5 degrees alive by eliminating emissions as quickly as possible. Next slide, please.
Next slide. Yes. Next
slide.
It's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not seeing on the screen. There we go. Okay. So if we're thinking, how do we actually get these NDCs to progress as fast as possible and eliminate emissions as quickly as possible, there are really two models there. And one is a top-down model, which is the idea that countries set NDCs to meet long-term targets and then develop national climate policies to fulfill their Paris commitments. And then the other is a bottom-up model, which says that economic and political factors determine the ambition of national climate policies, and it's those that limit the level of ambition in the NDCs. And the fact is that multiple empirical studies lend strong support to the bottom-up model. And so enhanced NDC ambition results primarily from improving the economic and political feasibility of emissions mitigation within individual countries. It comes more from that than it does from the calls from science that we need to constrain the NDCs quickly. And then coming out of a lot of the work that we've been doing here at ETH, as well as many other universities, we see that the transitions framework provides guidance on how international cooperation can support this. Next slide, please. Next slide. This isn't working so well. Can whoever is changing the slides move to the next one on that PowerPoint? There we go, fantastic. And maybe even if you blow it up so you do go into display mode, that would be great. This figure here, it's a complex figure, and I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm going to actually blow up on part of it, but it was in the cross-chapter box on transitions dynamics that came out in the AR6 in Working Group 3. I was a part of it with a number of colleagues developing this figure and the logic that comes behind it. And the logic is that policies that best accelerate societal transitions to net zero systems do so by addressing the barriers specific to 4 stages within the transitions process. And those 4 stages are emergence, early adoption, diffusion, and finally stabilization around new technologies. The emergence and early adoption stages primarily seem to happen in wealthy countries, whereas lower income countries can leapfrog to the diffusion stage. And it's also the diffusion
Tony, I'm
stage.
sorry, Tony, I would have just to stop a bit, just a moment, to arrange definitely technical problems. We get back in 2 minutes. I'm really sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Tony, it's okay. So we are going to get back to your slide. Please tell us.
Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your understanding. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I was at the last bullet point on this slide. So it's really at the diffusion stage, which is the point at which low carbon technologies begin to make a difference for emissions. So next slide, please. If we look in at the diffusion, no, back. There we go. Thank you. If we think about where international cooperation makes a difference, it's primarily in the lower income countries. And the critical technologies for decarbonization in the lower income countries are renewable power generation, electrification of transport, and the greening of industrial policies of production. And if we think about the policies then that can make a difference, in this figure here, we see infrastructure development, revised regulatory frameworks, and enhancement of financial flows. And in fact, our research has shown these to make a huge difference within the international realm. So international cooperation can address the barriers through infrastructure, governance, capacity raising, and finance. And in particular, it's finance that appears to be most crucial. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is from some research that we did a few years ago. It shows the competitiveness of large-scale solar power with electricity storage compared to fossil power generation, looking at the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. And what you see on the left-hand graph is a picture which is okay for Southern Africa, where solar generation is marginally competitive, but not so great in equatorial and Western and East Africa, where fossil generation is still the least cost option. But if we compare this to the middle graph, where finance mechanisms, in accordance with the Paris Agreement, reduce the cost of borrowing to construct this solar infrastructure, we see the solar become green across all of the continent. And then the right-hand figure shows what happens if we include the finance mechanisms with Paris, plus all of the other mechanisms for increased governance capacity. So really, the finance makes a huge difference. And if we think of the bottom-up model of what drives NDCs, it's this which drives more ambition. We have ongoing work, we haven't published it yet, which I think is even more exciting. It shows a very similar finding with respect to electrified transport. And by addressing the cost of capital in lower income countries, we can make electrification of transport a win-win option right now. And it's that which will really improve our prospects. Okay, last and final slide, please. So just to conclude, we keep 1.5 degrees alive by enhancing the ambition of national climate policies and the NDCs that determine these as rapidly as possible. But for this, it's critical for national policies and international cooperation to address the barriers to the rapid diffusion of low-carbon technologies. And international cooperation likely has the strongest role to play in lower-income countries through mechanisms that reduce the costs of financing climate-compatible investments, either through multilateral lending or de-risking approaches. And that's it from me. I'm very sorry that this didn't go off quite as smoothly as we had hoped, but I hope it was interesting for those in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony. I'm very sorry to have cut you in the middle of your presentation, but it was very clear. And what I really appreciated is that usually we show that there is a very important role of multilateralism. And in particular, your chapter in the last assessment of the IPCC, I really advise to everybody to read it, shows the benefits from multilateralism and cooperation. But usually we also say after that these contribution, those pledges are only pledges, and then there is that implementation gap, implementation issue. And you also shows us right now how important is international cooperation, multilateralism, finance, which is the topic of this year, is important to bridge this implementation gap as well. So many thanks for your presentation. And now I would give the floor to our last presenter, who is Paola Castro, and she's going to talk about NDC ambition, mitigation, policy efforts, and the engagement as well in transnational climate governance initiatives. Paola, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much, Geraldine, for the invitation to present our work in this side event. This work is very complementary to what Tony Pratt just presented. We are also trying to look at what drives the ambition of NDCs, but more importantly, what drives mitigation policy effort within countries. And this, next slide, please. So this research departs from the idea that keeping 1.5 degrees alive, it not only requires more ambitious NDCs, but also the corresponding mitigation policies and measures at the national level to meet those NDC targets, right? And this graph shows us very clear, in order to get to our global temperature goal of 1.5 degrees, we need ambitious NDCs. We don't have them, we still have this ambition gap, but we need the policies and measures that reach the pledges promised in the NDCs. And also there, we still have a policy adoption gap. And going further down, we need that those policies are implemented and enforced in a way that the outcomes in terms of emissions are really in line with the pledges and with the global goal, right? And so in this research, we look at both the ambition gap and the policy adoption gap and try to see what other drivers are driving those gaps, right? Tony Pratt talked a lot about the role of finance, multilateral finance, which is really important. We are looking at another aspect, which is countries' engagement in transnational governance initiatives. So what is this? Next slide, please. Since in the last decade, and particularly since the Paris Agreement, we have seen that the global climate change regime has been transitioning towards more decentralized governance, with more informal partnerships and networks and initiatives by different types of actors at all levels of governance, from the multilateral to the subnational, involving also non-state actors that are all concerned with climate policy and climate change governance, right? And in the political science literature, we know this as polycentric governance. Governance with different centers of authority that partly overlap in terms of actors, in terms of sectors, in terms of authority, but that are very diverse in terms of their goals, the way they function, the institutions, but they all more or less have the same goals, coming from the overarching institution that is the Paris Agreement, right? They are all targeting climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the 1.5 degrees net zero emissions, right? Some examples are, for example, the city networks that we know, ICLEI, C40, or sectoral initiatives such as the Global Methane Initiative, Clean Energy Ministerial, etc., but also reporting initiatives like the Climate Registry or the Science-Based Target Initiatives. All of these form a patchwork of many initiatives, transnational initiatives that form part of this more diverse climate change regime that we are looking at right now, right? And this system has been described very well, but we still don't know how effective this is in really helping to reach the Paris Agreement goals, and that's what this research focuses on. Next one, please. So basically, our research question is, to what extent is the climate regime's increasing reliance on these transnational climate governance initiatives related to more ambitious climate policy performance by the states, by the countries, in terms of more ambitious NDCs, but also in terms of stronger national mitigation policy efforts. And so we try to measure, please, the next one. One more click, please. One more click. Yeah. We look at NDC ambition and at mitigation policy effort. And how do we measure this? For NDC ambition, we look at the greenhouse gas emissions that each country would emit if they were conforming to their fair share of the global effort to reach 1.5 degrees, and the greenhouse gas emissions that they will actually emit if they achieve their NTC. Right? So the difference between these two, as shown in the graph, is the gap in NDC ambition by each country. Right? And on the other hand, we are looking at mitigation policy effort, looking at the policies that each country has adopted to address mitigation since 2014, since the year where they presented their first intended nationally determined contributions. And here we look at all mitigation policy documents, from laws, regulations, but also towards climate plans, strategies, roadmaps, etc. We also look at just the strongest of those policy documents, really the laws and decrees that have some implementation character. And we also look at the instruments within those policy documents, for example, regulations, bans, obligations, taxes, subsidies, those instruments that really drive climate action at national level. Next one, please. And we explain the adoption of these instruments and the ambition of the NDC by looking at state-level engagement in transnational climate governance initiatives, basically to how many of these initiatives each state is a member of, but also we look at the subnational or non-state engagement in these initiatives. So how many organizations within a country are taking part in these initiatives. And we use statistical methods. We also control for other explanations of engagement of climate action, such as dependence on fossil fuels,
climate change vulnerability, income, democracy, that we know affect level of engagement and of policy. So what do we find? For NDC ambition, we see that there's basically no effect of taking part in these transnational governance initiatives at state or sub-state, non-state level. Basically, we see that countries have more ambitious NDCs when they are poorer. Poorer countries have NDCs that are more in line with their fair share of the global effort to reduce emissions, but also NDCs that are more ambitious are in countries that have lower dependence on fossil fuels. So it's basically this interest-based explanation that for us in our research explains NDC ambition. However, if we look more at the national level, at policy adoption, we do see a clear effect that the more the countries are engaged in transnational initiatives at the state or the sub-state non-state level, the stronger their mitigation policy effort, the more policies they adopt, the stronger policies they adopt, and the stronger policy instruments that are included in these policies. And interestingly, we see that this effect of engagement is stronger for the developing or non-NS1 countries. Yeah, so how do we explain these findings? First, well, NDC ambition is more of a political question. It's so far not related to this engagement in transnational governance, but we see that mitigation policy effort is clearly related to the transnational governance, that this effect is more strong in developing countries. And the central explanation for this is capacity, right? It's not just finance, it's not just the fact that these are developing countries, it's also the fact that under the Kyoto Protocol, under the previous regime, they didn't need to have the organizations, the institutions, the climate emissions monitoring and reporting systems that they now need under the Paris Agreement. So engagement in this ecosystem of governance initiatives helps them to compensate for that historically lower capacity to address climate change mitigation. So here we are we're seeing the importance of learning, of knowledge sharing with other actors, of experimenting with policy, engagement also at the local level with policy for state level action to actually work, right? So this points to the crucial role of capacity building, in addition to finance, which is what Tony was pointed out. It's knowledge sharing so that NDCs are implemented in a way that we really meet those targets and hopefully keep 1.5 degrees alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paola, for this very complementary perspective on capacity building, international cooperation, and the way all those support for means of implementation in complement of finance are very crucial to give all the credibility and to trigger the capacity of implementing NDCs. As we have some kind of technical problems, but I really want to thank you for having arranged everything. But as a negotiator, I obtained 15 minutes of discussion, so I'm going to sit here, and we have still Tony with us, and maybe we can have a chat and discuss on these topics, and yeah, for this until kind of 5:50. Thank you. So, would you like to raise some question? Take the floor. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself, because I know you, but not everybody knows you. So, yeah, Tony is hearing us. Yes, he's still here. I left. Okay. I'm sorry. But you can put your question on the table, and it was full anyway.
So, hi, my name is Abhishek. I'm a scientist at EAWAG. My question was just connecting what you, Paula, said and what Tony presented, was because Tony was saying that multilateralism really works, and it works really well in low-income countries, lower-income countries, right? And in your presentation, you also highlighted how it's the low-income countries where the NDC's targets are much better in terms of their fair share equivalence, right? So I feel like we're doing something good or something right and something wrong. Like we're doing something right in terms of the growing climate, where a lot of the impacts of climate change are, but the biggest contributors to climate change are obviously the high-income countries. And according to both your research, it says multilateralism doesn't actually work as well. That's totally wrong. And what you're saying is their contributions are obviously not their fair share, right? So I feel like the elephant in the room is that is what needs to be addressed. And I'm wondering, how do we use these kinds of results to actually mobilize more attention on that aspect? Because this is yet another argument which is which is not made loud enough.
Thank you. It's a very smart question. Thank you, Paola. Please answer.
Yes, I mean, I think we need both, right? We need more ambitious NDCs by the developed countries, right? And I mean, it also depends on how you measure these fair shares. And the version we use looks at cumulative emissions, so it's the historical responsibility plus the capacity to act, so also income, right? So, and that puts a very strong level of responsibility on the developed countries. If you measure it differently, the results change a little bit. But still, the message is developed countries need to do as much as possible. And if they cannot really meet that fair shares, what can they do? They can provide finance. Finance is another way of contributing to their fair share of action and achieve emission reductions in developing countries. And I don't know if you were this morning at Al Gore's presentation. He was saying, actually, in many developing countries, the same solar plant that you install there compared to Europe achieves much more emission reductions because the grid is much dirtier there, right? So we need that finance to flow to developing countries in order to more easily achieve these targets. Yeah, and we need both. That would be, and in terms of the positive side, multilateralism works if we get that finance flowing, but that's what Tony is saying. If we have finance, then it works, but the finance is not yet there, right? And what I'm saying is, okay, there are these other initiatives that are helping provide capacity in terms of policy adoption. But again, we need the next step, right? We need the policy, but we also need the finance in order to support the implementation in the end.
Carrie, you would like to complement?
Very significant is that what can be done to bring those perspectives. And I think, because I've been working on IPCC for quite some time, and what we need is more social sciences within those institutions, more social sciences also to explain and to bring those insights as well to the negotiations and to those expert bodies.
I wanted to jump on the fair share issue. What kind of criteria or indicator or databases are you using? Like the climate action tracker, like the climate equity reference? What tool you use as a researcher to assess the fair share?
We use, for this paper, we were using data published by Nature Climate Change by a researcher, Rubio Ducon. He's a French researcher, and his work has been taken up by the IPCC as well. So we have developed, it's different work with different methods of fair share, and this is the one that best mirrors the TVDR idea, right, of capacity and responsibility. That's why we took that one, but we have done it with others.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, Niklas?
I come in on the fair share because I think the fair share is an excellent example of that we need as well in GST and other processes. We need to really bring together civil society, politics, and science because it's a highly normative question. Like Paris, like we can have a global budget of when we will reach maybe 1.5, 1.7, 1.9 or something, but like the share it's like an ethical question, right? Which politically can be debated. And I think maybe this French researcher has done it this way, but there are a million other ways of doing it. And I think the TST is a very interesting plane for this reason, because it cannot be only solved by scientists determining how Paris was actually implemented, or what is the process and progress in implementing Paris. We need the different perspectives there.
I would just jump in a bit. For me, it's an unsolvable question, fair share. Equity is not solvable, but it has to be debated and deliberated. That's a key. And the fact is that the IPCC and also several researchers, when they put different kind of criteria, as you mentioned, those different kind of criteria are interesting. And I think that the quest is not to find the definition that is mutually agreed, but the way that we can converge on that kind of deliberation.
I mean, that's why we have a Paris Agreement, right? This self-determined contribution, because parties were not able to agree on a formula to divide the pie. It's just impossible politically, right? Each stakeholder chooses the formula that works best for them, for their own interests. So I agree, it's unsolvable, but yes, we need to discuss it. Yes, we need to see how well on track are we, and call the actors into action and tell them, hey, you are doing too little, you need to do more, right?
Other question, points? Maybe Alex, and then
I just have a very short question. The optimistically obviously are with you wholeheartedly. But when I look at the reality on the ground with foresight in mind, what we see is a new administration in the White House, which is not only planning to pull out of the Paris Accord, but also what I heard here at COP from UNFCCC. Which means that we have to come up with alternatives so that multilateralism can yield the result. Is there any viable alternative to the system we have today?
Okay, I think UNFCCC it's more difficult because that would need ratification by the Congress and the filibuster. So I don't think they have a simple majority, but they don't have this level of majority
to get out, to get back
out of the UNFCCC.
Get out.
Yeah, I mean the Paris Agreement.
Get back, it will be even more complicated.
Yeah, exactly. The Paris Agreement they can do because that's executive, but the UNFCCC it needs to go to Congress, and I think that's not so. But I don't know.
Even if with the current majority of the Republicans,
that's a simple majority, and you need the filibuster level majority, the 66%, I think. I don't know exactly, but
okay.
If there's any US monarchy, we can ask.
Yeah.
But in that eventuality, do you see any alternative to the regime that we have today?
Yeah, but then I don't want to cut you. You was.
I mean, that's what she was saying as well. Renewables are now competitive. I see the business case for clean energy as the main driver. I mean, this process has been going on for 30 years and it has not delivered. But we are now at a stage where clean energy has a business case without all of this. We need to accelerate it. Yeah, that's what we need to make it faster. But actually,
I think that if the states are leaving both the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, we will get back on what was the case at the end of the Kyoto Protocol, which was tired protocol, not working at all, regulating less than 30 or 40% of emissions. And what happened is that kind of polycentric governance where we have kind of new initiatives coming from local governments, firms, sectors. That could be a good thing, and even in the United States, a good news. But still, like for all the polycentric governance, perseverance and justice and free riding, and how you measure the global efforts and who is taking part to that effort. So So for me, even if we would have some processes that are fueled from the bottom, more again, it will be there will be several action missing at the more top-down level, and that would be an issue.
Maybe on the US, I mean, the US have always been in and out. So it's not that we haven't already been dealing with the US putting their conditions and then leaving. So we have experience with it. It's also Kyoto, right?
That's right.
And maybe last point is, I think as well, we are moving from Kyoto into a different world. So I think there are other countries who are very keen to take a bigger role, and I would expect that like the business case together with different power dynamics since Kyoto are making a case that the US is becoming less relevant in the world.
And state level governance. I mean, California is doing a lot. Some of the biggest states in the US are doing a lot. Even Texas, so much wind power there. They don't talk about it as climate policy, but it's money that goes to the farmers because you have wind power in all of these huge farms, and they profit from that. So, yeah.
Any questions? I would have one. What is a 1.5 aligned NDC? I would have that question hearing all of you because I was thinking this. Would it be a 1.5 just to declare, like the UAE made it, or the UK announced it as well, and maybe some countries will make it, you never know, this coming weeks, having new pledges, announcements, or would we have, do you think, at this stage to downplay all those pledges and say, let's consider the real policies behind how they are supporting their 1.5 in their NDCs. What do you have a view on this?
This is not my area at all. I'm not a social scientist, but I think you have to look at the policies. I research the cryosphere, and we have to stick to 1.5. So if we go with the comma that you suggested, we won't truly. So every tiny little increase matters. So I think we do need to look at what are people actually doing.
Yeah. No, I love the question because I was wondering about this as well. I think it goes very much, for me, it really relates to the question on the fair shares, because 1.5 aligned for a single country, like we need to determine what is the fair share, and we just said like we can't determine this, so I don't think that, I think it's a very bold statement and not possible statement to say 1.5 aligned, because like, we need to have assumptions about historical responsibilities and all of these. So I don't think it's very possible, but still, what is probably the best we can do is to really look into the nitty-gritty and try to understand like the level of detail which they put into the policies. This is, I think, the best one. Like as ambitious as possible, I think, is in 1.5.
Thank you. If there is no other question, I would like to thank all of you. It was very nice discussion as well around this table. And thank you. And I will propose just make a picture in front of the kimono. Thanks to Tura and help. Thank you, Tura, for the organization.